Shiwai had never thought of the library as a place where time could bend. Usually, it was just quiet. The rustle of pages, the occasional cough, the muted footsteps of someone searching for a book they half remembered. But that evening, everything felt different. Maybe it was because she was there. I'd noticed her a few times before, always in the same corner table near the tall windows, reading with an intensity that made the whole world seem smaller. Tonight, the sunset poured in, streaks of amber and gold softening the edges of her face. I wasn't looking for her, but the moment I saw her, I forgot why I had come at all. I walked past her once, pretending to be absorbed in the shelves. Twice. On the third pass, I caught her glancing up, her eyes lingering for a second longer than casual politeness required. It was enough. "Do you always sit here?" I asked, my voice low, careful not to disturb the hushed atmosphere. Her smile was polite, but there was something behind it, a guarded warmth. "It depends on the light," she said, closing her book but keeping her finger tucked inside, as if unwilling to let go entirely. I sat across from her, nerves buzzing just under my skin. The table was wide, but the quiet between us made the space feel intimate, like we'd already stepped into something unspoken. "You don't look old enough to be interested in this," she said after a pause, tilting the cover of her book toward me. It was a collection of essays, dense and heavy, not the kind of thing most people my age reached for. I laughed softly. Maybe I just like listening to voices that sound like they've lived longer than mine. Her brow lifted, a hint of surprise softening into curiosity. She leaned forward slightly, and the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle, elegant, reached me. "You mean to say you're drawn to wisdom? Or maybe to people who carry it?" I replied before I could stop myself. The words hung there. I should have been embarrassed, but the way her eyes searched mine made me feel steadier. She looked at me as if trying to read between my lines, to decide whether I meant what I'd said or if I was just too bold for my own good. "You're too young to flatter," she murmured finally, though the smile at the edge of her lips betrayed her restraint. "Maybe," I admitted, "but it doesn't mean I don't mean it." Her hand rested on the table, and without realizing it, mine drifted close, not touching, just near enough for the warmth to bridge the gap. She didn't pull away. She didn't move closer either. But her stillness said everything she had noticed. In that silence, broken only by the rustling pages of strangers around us, something passed between us, delicate, dangerous, and undeniably real. And for the first time, the library didn't feel like a place for borrowed words. It felt like the beginning of a story we weren't sure we were allowed to write. Renedme to Esti, the forecast had promised a clear evening, but by the time we stepped outside, the first drops were already sliding down the air. I'd offered to walk her home, not out of duty, but because the thought of letting the moment end at the library door felt impossible. She hesitated at first, her umbrella tucked neatly under her arm. "You don't have to," she said, as though reminding both of us of an invisible boundary. "I know," I replied, meeting her eyes. "That's why I want to." She didn't argue. Instead, she let me match my pace with hers, the soft patter of rain quickening overhead. By the time we reached the edge of the street, it had turned heavy, a silver curtain that blurred the world around us. She opened her umbrella, just wide enough for us to fit beneath. It was a small thing, but sharing that narrow space meant our arms brushed with every step. The scent of rain mixed with her perfume, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you're exactly where you should be. "You really are too young for this," she said suddenly, her voice quieter than the rain. Her words carried a mixture of concern and something softer, something she couldn't quite hide. "For walking in the rain?" I teased lightly, though my chest tightened at her tone. "For looking at me the way you do," she whispered, almost to herself. The streetlight above us flickered, scattering golden reflections across the wet pavement. I wanted to answer, to tell her that what I felt wasn't a phase or a game, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I shifted closer, the edge of my sleeve brushing against hers. She noticed. Of course she did. Every tiny movement seemed magnified under that umbrella, every pause heavy with meaning. Finally, she stopped walking altogether, turning to face me fully. The rain drummed steadily on the umbrella above us, cocooning us in sound. She studied me, her gaze steady, searching. For a moment, I thought she might step back. Instead, she reached up, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear, her hand trembling just enough to betray her composure. "You'll regret this one day," she murmured. I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. "No. The only thing I'd regret is pretending I don't feel what I feel." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she let out a breath, the kind that carries years of restraint. Slowly, she lowered the umbrella, letting the rain fall freely around us. Drops landed in her hair, glistening against her skin, and in that raw, unguarded moment, she looked more beautiful than I had ever seen. She didn't step into my arms. She didn't kiss me, but she let her hand find mine, fingers threading with a hesitation that dissolved as soon as our palms met. And just like that, standing in the rain, silence said everything neither of us dared to. I away, but the rain had softened to a drizzle by the time we reached her doorway. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers still damp, and for a moment I wondered if she would draw the line there. A polite thank you, a careful good night. But instead, she pushed the door open and glanced back. "Come in," she said, almost reluctantly, like the words had escaped before she could reconsider. Inside, the quiet was different from the library, different from the rain. It was warmer, alive with the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock on the wall. I slipped off my shoes, suddenly aware of the intimacy of stepping into her space. A space that felt lived in and elegant, with books stacked neatly and a single vase of flowers on the counter. She busied herself with small tasks, perhaps to disguise her nerves. A kettle clicked on, her hands moving gracefully, but not as steady as before. I leaned against the doorway to the kitchen, watching her. "You're staring," she said, without turning around. "Maybe," I admitted, "but only because I don't want to forget this." She set 2 cups on the counter, her shoulders tightening. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" Finally, she turned to face me. Her eyes, steady, conflicted, searching, locked on mine. "Because you'll make me believe you mean them." The words hit harder than I expected. For a second, I didn't move. Then, slowly, I stepped closer. The space between us shrank until I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the faint tremor in her breath. "I do mean them," I said softly. She looked away, her hand gripping the counter as though steadying herself. "You're young. You'll move on. Find someone who makes more sense." But her voice faltered on the last word, and I knew she didn't believe it. Without thinking, I reached out. My hand brushed against hers, hesitant at first. She didn't pull away. I let my fingers rest there, covering her hand, grounding her. Her eyes returned to mine, wide and vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the kettle, building toward a boil. "I'm scared," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. I swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. "So am I. But that doesn't make this wrong." The kettle clicked off, breaking the silence, but neither of us moved to pour the tea. Instead, she let her free hand rise, brushing lightly against my cheek. The touch was fleeting, almost uncertain, but it left a trail of warmth that spread through me. Her thumb lingered near my jaw, trembling slightly. Then she pulled back, shaking her head as if chastising herself. "This shouldn't be happening," she whispered. But the way her hand had lingered told me everything. Way her eyes lingered told meth kettle had long gone silent. But neither of us moved to touch it. We stood there, hands close enough to feel the heat from one another, hearts caught in a rhythm neither of us had planned. Finally, she exhaled, a sound that was equal parts surrender and self-defense. "You should sit," she said softly, motioning toward the small table near the window. I obeyed, though the distance felt heavier than it should have. She joined me a moment later, setting the untouched cups of tea between us. Her posture was composed, but her fingers tapped lightly against the mug, betraying the tension she carried. For a while, we didn't speak. The rain outside had quieted to a soft drizzle, tapping gently against the glass. It felt like the world had paused, waiting for us to decide what came next. When she finally looked up, her gaze was steady but threaded with vulnerability. "Do you know why this scares me?" she asked. I shook my head. "Because it feels real." Her voice faltered on the last word, like it had cost her something to admit it. "And real things demand consequences." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the table. "Then let it be real. Let it be whatever it wants to be." Her eyes softened, and for the first time that evening, She let a small laugh escape, quiet, almost incredulous. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine. The contact was deliberate this time, not accidental, not hesitant. "You don't make this easy," she whispered. "Maybe it's not supposed to be easy," I replied. Her hand lingered on mine, her thumb tracing slow, absent patterns against my skin. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes, of affection, of hesitation, of a longing she could no longer deny. We sat like that for what felt like forever, not speaking, not moving, just letting the closeness exist without rushing it into something it wasn't ready to be. When she finally stood, it wasn't to end the evening. It was to come closer. She moved to the chair beside me, sitting so near that our shoulders touched. The warmth of her presence was grounding, a quiet affirmation that I wasn't imagining what was between us. She turned her face toward me, her hair brushing against my cheek. "Whatever this is," she said softly, "promise me you'll be patient with it." "With me?" I nodded, my chest tightening with the weight of her trust. "I promise." She leaned in then, not for a kiss, but for something gentler, her lips pressed briefly against my cheek. The kind of touch that lingers long after it's gone. When she pulled back, her smile carried both relief and uncertainty, but it was genuine. And in that moment, I knew. Nothing between us had been decided, nothing labeled or defined. Yet everything had shifted. The night had not given us answers. Only the beginning of something neither of us could ignore anymore. She wanted me closer. I woke earlier than I expected, though sleep had come slowly. The rain from the night before had cleared, leaving the sky washed pale, the kind of morning light that feels both fragile and hopeful. Her kitchen was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. She was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug in her hand, her posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen the night before. The sight of her in that morning calm, hair loosely tied back, a softness in her expression, struck me harder than I wanted to admit. "You're awake," she said, her voice low but carrying the faintest trace of a smile. I nodded, slipping into the chair I had occupied just hours earlier. The teacups from last night still sat on the table, untouched, a quiet reminder of everything that had passed and everything that hadn't. For a long moment, we didn't speak. She sipped her coffee, eyes focused on the steam rising from the cup as if it held the answers to questions neither of us had dared to voice. Finally, she set the mug down and looked at me directly. "You know, last night doesn't mean everything is simple now," she said. "I know." My voice was steady, though my heart pressed against my ribs. "But it also doesn't mean nothing happened." Her lips curved faintly, the ghost of a smile. "You're stubborn. Or just honest," I countered gently. She walked over, pulling out the chair beside me. When she sat, the air shifted, the kind of closeness that demanded acknowledgement. Her hand rested on the table, close but not touching mine, like she was testing the space between us. "People will notice," she whispered. "They'll ask questions." "Let them," I said, my gaze fixed on hers. "I'm not ashamed of how I feel." Something in her eyes softened then, a quiet relief that she quickly tried to mask. She exhaled slowly, as though letting go of a weight she'd been carrying alone for too long. This time, when her hand moved toward mine, there was no hesitation. Her fingers slipped between mine with ease, her grip firm, grounding. The warmth of her touch spread through me, steady and sure. We sat like that in the pale morning light, the silence between us no longer heavy, but full of unspoken promises, of patience, of a trust that had been cautiously offered and quietly accepted. At last, she leaned toward me, her shoulder brushing mine, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we do this, we do it slowly. Carefully." I nodded, my thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "Slow is fine, as long as it's real." Her smile was small, but it reached her eyes this time, a kind of smile that felt like the beginning of something unshakable. And in that morning stillness, I realized we didn't need certainty yet. What we had was enough. Weeks passed, though in my memory, it feels like everything still lingers in the quiet of that rainy night, that morning light. The world didn't change for anyone else. Neighbors still greeted her politely. People still mistook me for a student rushing between errands. But for us, something subtle and unspoken had shifted. We didn't declare anything. There were no labels, no bold proclamations. Instead, it was the small things that began to define us. The way she let her hand rest on the table a little longer when I sat beside her. The way I found excuses to carry her groceries, though she never asked. The way our conversations stretched into the late hours, dipping into parts of her past she'd never shared with anyone, and parts of my future I'd never voiced aloud. And always, that undercurrent. Not rushed, not flaunted, but undeniably present. Sometimes she would remind me, gently but firmly, we have to be careful. Other times, her eyes would betray her, lingering on me longer than she meant to, softening in ways words never could. It wasn't always easy. There were days when her hesitation felt like distance, when I wondered if the age in her eyes would always remind her to step back, even as my heart wanted her closer. But then there were moments, quiet, fleeting, when I knew she felt it too. Moments that told me we were both learning how to exist in this delicate balance. One evening, weeks after that first walk in the rain, we sat together on her balcony. The city stretched out below, lights flickering against the dusk. She leaned against the railing, her silhouette calm and graceful. I joined her, close enough that our shoulders brushed. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked softly, the question escaping before I could weigh it down with fear. She turned to me, her eyes thoughtful, searching. For a moment, I thought she might retreat into silence. But instead, she shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice firm, though a hint of vulnerability slipped through. "What I regret is how long I told myself not to feel anything." The honesty in her words struck me harder than I expected. I reached for her hand, not bold, not urgent, just steady. She let me take it, her fingers curling naturally into mine. We stood like that, watching the lights below, the hum of the city wrapping around us. No one else knew what existed between us, and maybe that was the point. It wasn't for anyone else to define. In the end, it wasn't the rain, the kitchen, or even the morning after that stayed with me most. It was this, the quiet courage of her presence, the way she let me in piece by piece, and the way silence became our truest language. And as I held her hand under the fading sky, I realized, sometimes the most forbidden things aren't meant to be hidden. They're simply meant to be cherished slowly, carefully, until they feel like home. It wasn't our secret anymore, not entirely. She had invited me, almost casually, to a small dinner at her place. A few friends from her circle, people closer to her age, people who knew her history, her career, her carefully constructed composure. I told myself not to overthink it. But as I stood in her living room, surrounded by laughter and wine glasses, I could feel the difference in every glance. They were kind, polite, but curious. Their eyes flicked between us. Me, the uninvited variable, and her, the woman who had always seemed so firmly in control of her own story. At first, I felt out of place. Their conversations wove around experiences I hadn't lived, careers that spanned decades, old friendships filled with stories I couldn't add to. I laughed when they laughed, offered smiles where words felt thin. But then she looked at me. Just one glance across the room, her expression softening in a way no one else could see. It was enough to quiet the noise in my head. Later, as dishes were cleared and the group settled into smaller conversations, I found her in the kitchen. She was rinsing glasses, her sleeves rolled up, her movements practiced but quieter than usual. "You're handling this well," she said without turning. Her voice carried a note of teasing, but also relief. "I wasn't sure I belonged," I admitted, leaning against the doorway. "But then you looked at me, and it didn't matter anymore." She paused, her hands stilling under the water. Slowly, she dried them and turned, her eyes meeting mine. "That's why I invited you," she said softly. "Because I needed to know if it could feel natural. If we could exist in the same space without it being questioned." "And?" I asked, my chest tightening. Her gaze lingered on me, steady and unguarded. "And it feels more natural than I expected." The weight of her words pressed gently against the space between us. I stepped closer, closing the gap until I could feel the warmth radiating from her. My hand brushed against hers on the counter, subtle, grounding. She didn't move away. "Do you see how they look at us?" she whispered, a flicker of doubt in her tone. "Yes," I admitted. "But I also saw how you looked at me. That's the only thing I noticed that mattered." For a moment, silence stretched. Then, with a soft exhale, she leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against my chest. The gesture was small, almost hidden, but it carried the weight of trust she rarely gave away. I wrapped my arms around her carefully, holding her without words. The sound of laughter from the living room floated in, but here, in the quiet of her kitchen, it felt like the world had narrowed to just us. When she finally pulled back, her eyes shone with something unspoken, not fear this time, but a quiet acceptance. And I knew then, we weren't just balancing on the edge of possibility anymore. We were stepping, together, into something real.